And they got like 18,000 comment letters, and some of the comment letters are hundreds of pages long, and so it's just a long process.
How long?
I think the other thing is,
That conversation from this morning's Washington Journal. See it in its entirety at our website, cspan.org. And now back live to Capitol Hill as the U.S. House has returned for further debate. Votes coming up at 3 p.m.
The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
And, Mr. Speaker, I would ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous materials in the record on the bill.
Without objection, so ordered.
And, Mr. Speaker, I would yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act of 2013. H.R. 2019, authored by my colleague Greg Harper, is a bill that will help countless kids and families across the country. The Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act would prioritize funding for the research of pediatric diseases and disorders such as cancer, autism, and Fragile X. It would eliminate taxpayer financing of party conventions, political money, and use these funds instead to expand pediatric research at the NIH Common Fund, through their Common Fund. This bill certainly does put kids first. You know, Gabriella Miller was a little warrior in the battle against childhood cancer. At only 10 years of age, she had the courage miles beyond her years. A frying pan and a walnut is all you need to understand her brave outlook on life. When she was diagnosed with brain cancer, she was told that the size of that tumor was about like a walnut. And from then on, Gabriella traveled with her trusty frying pan, squashing countless walnuts along the way all over the world. And that's the kind of courage and outlook on life that she had. Advancing health research for millions of young patients who suffer from rare and genetic diseases has got to be a priority. And while we've made great strides in the country in finding cures and treatments, we certainly have a great amount of work to do. Included in this work is pushing for research that is going to help uncover cures for pediatric diseases. In order for clinical trials and other advancements to meet their full potential, adequate resources have got to be directed for pediatric research. The legislation is an example of how much can be accomplished by ending wasteful spending and redirecting those funds towards national priorities like pediatric research. This effort is going to help families like the Kennedys in Mattawan, Michigan, my constituents. Eric and Sarah Kennedy have 2 wonderful little girls, Brooke and Brielle, who have the rare disease called spinal muscular atrophy. These 2 little angels, who are fighting SMA with the same vigor and sunny outlook exhibited by Gabriella, are decorated little generals in the effort to boost research for rare diseases and serve as an inspiration for every one of us. The sad reality is that it is often difficult to conduct research into rare diseases due to the small number of individuals with those diseases. But we're working to change that, yes we are, and provide families with greater hope for a cure in advances of treatment. This bill has over 150 co-sponsors. It's supported by a long list of patient advocacy groups, including Autism Speaks, Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and Fight MSA. So I wholeheartedly agree with the bill's Democrat sponsor, Peter Welch from Vermont, who recently said last night on CNN, can we just put the battle axes down for a while and take a step forward? He thinks we can. We need to. So with all of us today, with these so many diseases, we need to pass this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the bill before us today because it is a disingenuous and empty attempt by the Republicans to divert attention from the fact that they have voted to cut research time and time again. So instead, they will stand before the American public with words that they have no action to back up. The National Institutes of Health serve a vital mission of supporting biomedical research so that we may better understand and better treat diseases that burden American families. And I stand firmly in favor of supporting NIH research funding, especially as it relates to pediatric research. But let me be very clear for the record here today. H.R. 2019 does not achieve this purpose. Now, had this bill, which had been introduced back in May, gone through regular order and come to the Committee on Energy and Commerce for hearings and markup, we would have had the opportunity to discuss and debate the merits of the legislation. But this bill claims to support research on childhood diseases by authorizing, and I note not appropriating, but only authorizing, $12.6 million for NIH pediatric research grants through savings from ending the public contribution to the cost of political party nominating conventions. And I emphasize that the bill only authorizes funding because I'd like to point out that the appropriations needed to actually make these funds available to NIH would still be subject to discretionary spending caps of the Budget Control Act and sequestration cuts. Now, the sequester alone has cut $1.5 billion out of NIH's funding in fiscal year 2013. Even worse, through the Ryan budget, the Republicans adopted spending allocations for fiscal year 2014 that would make additional cuts to NIH, which could result in $6.7 billion in cuts in total. So for pediatric research, the proportional cut would amount to $800 million, which is 60 more times than the increase that this bill claims to provide. That's why I think the Republicans are not making a sincere effort to support NIH research. This is a joke. The best thing, Mr. Speaker, that we can do to support NIH and research on pediatric diseases is to pass a balanced and constructive budget package and to provide the Appropriations Committee with a reasonable and realistic amount of funding to work with. Until then, I would urge my colleagues to oppose this bill that is nothing but a guise. It's a ruse. It does nothing to ensure that we're increasing pediatric cancer research dollars. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to my friend from Virginia, member of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Wolf.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the Chair and the Speaker. I rise in support of legislation I've co-sponsored, the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act. I particularly want to thank the bill's sponsors, Greg Harper, Eric Cantor, and Mr. Wells from Vermont, for honoring the memory of my constituent, Gabrielle Miller, Loudoun County's Volunteer of the Year. Gabriella was a 10-year-old straight-A student at Loudoun County Day School who died on October 26 after a courageous one-year battle with an inoperable brain cancer tumor. In a short amount of time, she achieved many goals. She started the Smashing Walnuts Foundation, which refers to the walnut-sized tumor in her brain, a childhood cancer foundation. She co-wrote a children's book and received an honorary degree from Shenandoah University out in Winchester, Virginia. Last December, at her request, I wrote to Macy's as part of the massive 250,000 letter campaign she organized to benefit the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Gabriella raised a lot of money, and more importantly, she touched a lot of lives, and I'm sure she touched a lot of lives of members who are in this body. The bill before us today will help supplement existing NIH research efforts for childhood cancers and disorders by creating a 10-year Pediatric Research Initiative Fund paid for with the remaining presidential election campaign fund. I know her parents, Mark and Ellen, who are with us here today, her younger brother Jake, and her family and friends know of the remarkable impact she has had on our community, on our country, and on families that are facing this nationwide. I urge, hopefully, a unanimous vote on this, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. Gentleman from Michigan reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 3 minutes to the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Waxman.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise reluctantly to oppose this bill, and I first of all want to express to Gabriella Miller's family my sincere sympathies. We all want to fund more research to fight pediatric disease. Nothing could be a more worthy objective. If we could only reverse the cuts that this House has adopted under the Republicans' leadership, that NIH, the National Institutes of Health, could make an even greater amount of progress in understanding and treating so many different devastating diseases for children and for others. This bill never was heard in committee. We never had a chance to have witnesses come forward and talk about it or debate how best to achieve the bill's stated goals. That's why many of us think it's more a statement but not a credible proposal, especially when you look at the Republican House majority's record on biomedical research funding. It's a dismal one. They wrote and passed a bill which would have significantly cut NIH. They supported sequestration, which similarly reduced the NIH budget by nearly $2 billion in 2013 alone. And now this bill comes along where they claim to provide NIH with about $13 million a year for pediatric research. Well, that's a minuscule amount compared to the funding for pediatric research NIH lost due to Republican budget cuts and sequestration. Now, the way we usually handle NIH is the Appropriations Committee issues a bill appropriating money for NIH. They can do that. If we increase the money for NIH, they could do that. They don't need this bill to increase funding for pediatric research. What they need is a higher spending cap. And this bill doesn't bring about a higher spending cap. And then I have concerns I want to express about the way they structure the investments in pediatric research by funding it through NIH Director's Common Fund. By design, that fund is not disease or population specific because it gives NIH flexibility to determine funding priorities for each year. It doesn't take into consideration the existing pediatric research initiative, which we strengthened with recent enactment of pediatric research network legislation. Well, we have researchers all across the country have echoed the importance of a sustained NIH funding for our nation's health, our economic growth, our global leadership on biomedical research. May I have another minute from the gentleman?
Yield an additional minute to Mr. Waxman.
He was recognized for an additional minute.
Regrettably, this legislation before us does nothing to truly advance research at NIH. If we really had a sincere commitment to strengthen research at NIH, let's work together on a bipartisan basis. Let's have hearings on the legislation. Let's make sure that we have funding for all the research activities. And I think that we need to find a solution to restore NIH funding rather than purely symbolic legislation. This reminds me of the time when the Republicans closed the government. They refused to pass an appropriations bill for the government to function. And then people said, well, what about the parks? Then they said, well, we'll have a bill just to open the parks. What about NIH research? Well, they said, we'll do NIH research, but not the Centers for Disease Control and not for other things. Look, this is, if you're going to do the job, do it right. And don't pretend, especially to a family that's aggrieved, that you're really doing more for pediatric research when the overall NIH funds are not increased. Thank you, Jim.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 30 seconds before I yield to the next speaker.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to remind my friends that this is bipartisan legislation, and I congratulate Mr. Welch for being the lead Democratic sponsor. But I just want to say, too, in terms of looking at the money, the bill itself says all amounts in each account maintained for the National Committee of a major party or minor party under this section shall be transferred, shall, not may, shall be transferred to a fund in the Treasury to be known as the 10-year Pediatric Research Initiative Fund, which shall be available only for the purpose provided in Section 402AA2 of the Health Public Service Act and only to the extent and in such amounts as are provided in advance in appropriation acts. Tell me how to write it tougher. We did it. I yield now 2 minutes to the Majority Whip, Mr. McCarthy.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank Chairman Upton. I rise in support of 2019, named in the memory of a remarkable young lady, the Gabrielle Miller. The Gabrielle Miller Kids First Research Act gives pediatric research a shot in the arm through additional targeted funding, funding that is fully offset by reining in taxpayer funding of political conventions. The National Institute of Health works admirably in distributing important federal funding on basic medical research. But more can be done for childhood illness. In 2012, only 2% of NIH funding for research was spent on pediatric cases. Today's bill provides additional funding to the NIH to help address the need for coordinated research on various childhood diseases, including cancer, autism, and childhood diabetes. It helps provide a down payment to the promise that we have to our next generation by helping our scientists and researchers find the cures to childhood illness. There is no Republican or Democrat form of childhood illness, and there is no Republican or Democrat way to fight it. By working together on this bipartisan bill, we can put our children above the presidential politics of every 4 years. I want to thank my good friend, Congressman Greg Harper, Congressman Peter Welch, for their work on this legislation. I also want to thank Majority Leader Cantor for his continued leadership on these issues affecting America's families across the country. Vote yes on H.R. 2019. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back. Gentleman from Michigan reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I support this legislation, but I want to go through the controversy. First of all, the argument about campaign finance reform. This is about taking money away from political conventions. The majority on both sides of the aisle have supported that. Number two, there's an argument that this does not restore NIH funding. That is true. That is absolutely true. And we should restore full funding for the National Institute of Health. Passing this bill doesn't stop us from doing that. It may even put us a step forward. Third, there's an argument that the money will not get to the intended target because of the way it's designed. But if there is any expression of good faith, it's that the appropriators have made a very clear indication that they're willing to do everything they possibly can in order to make this happen. Fourth, it's limited in its scope and in its funds. That's true, but the fact is it does do something and it takes a step forward. You know, we're having an argument here about whether this is bipartisan or not. We're having an argument about process. But I think if we're candid, we have to acknowledge that as an institution, both sides have failed when it comes to an overall comprehensive budget, including for the NIH. On August 1st of 2011, this Congress voted 269 to 161 to implement the sequester. And in the I told you so brand of argument, I voted against that. And I voted against it because, in my view, the consequences of that sequester were predictable and foreseeable. These across-the-board cuts from the NIH to the Pentagon made no sense. But that's the box this institution, this House of Representatives, has put itself in. What we have, in my view, with this bill is an opportunity to lay down the battle axes for just a moment and take a step forward. No one is here, least of all me, where I'm being used to some extent as a bipartisan face, to suggest that this does more than it does. But what it does do is something good, and it can begin a process, my hope, that we restore full funding to the National Institute of Health. I yield back.
Our gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, I will yield 1 minute to the Majority Leader of the House, the Honorable Eric Cantor from Virginia.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman and the gentleman from Michigan. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act. I also would like to thank my colleague, the gentleman from Vermont, for his courage in providing bipartisan support, along with some other colleagues, in support of this bill, as well as the Republican co-sponsors, Greg Harper from Mississippi. I see Tom Koehl, my colleague from Oklahoma, here in this chamber. I also would like to recognize, for those colleagues who are here in the chamber, we are joined by Gabriella Miller's parents in the gallery, Ellen and Mark Miller. I want to thank them for their courage in being here. I want to thank them for their understanding of what goes on this floor, and to not take it in any other way other than we're trying to do what's right. And we're trying to do what's right in terms of delivering on the legacy of their daughter. Now, Mr. Speaker, Gabriella Miller, a young girl from Virginia, was only 9 years old when she found out she had an inoperable brain tumor the size of a walnut and wasn't given long to live. Despite her diagnosis, Gabriella and her family chose to fight and share her dream with others of overcoming childhood disease. Gabriella was so determined that she captivated people's hearts at rallies, online with videos, raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and even wrote a book for other children about understanding cancer. She poured every remaining ounce of her life into raising awareness for pediatric research for other children, with the hope that they would not have to suffer the same fate. In her last few months, Gabriella left a mark on the world that will never be forgotten. Mr. Speaker, there's no question that Washington has a spending problem. But the problem is not only that we spend too much, but that we're spending taxpayer dollars on the wrong priorities. Medical research for children should be a national priority. The first NIH bill I scheduled as Majority Leader was a bipartisan bill authored by Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers and Representative Lois Capps to strengthen pediatric research networks. The President signed the bill into law last month. The bill before us today builds on that legislation by providing some money through the NIH Common Fund for high-risk, high-reward research that has the potential to transform pediatric research for children suffering from many different diseases and disorders. For the first time, Congress will establish a Pediatric Research Initiative Fund that will serve as an accountability mechanism to help ensure that dollars are reaching their intended target. While all of us support the NIH, this bill is an opportunity to push the agency to make big discoveries that will improve and ultimately save so many lives. We don't have to accept the status quo as the best we can achieve. Yes, the NIH needs taxpayer resources, but it matters how we invest and apply those dollars. Now, Mr. Speaker, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say this is just a drop in the bucket compared to the sequester cuts. I agree. The sequester cuts were unfortunately indiscriminate, and I and my colleagues have proposed alternatives to them. But let's not let Washington politics get in the way of any effort to help these kids. This is one step of many that we should take together. How many times do we meet parents and families who share their stories and ask for help? Well, I recently had the privilege of meeting Gabriella's parents, Ellen and Mark, and they personally shared with me Gabriella's fighting spirit. In fact, in one of her last interviews, and you can view this online, when asked what Gabriella would like to tell our political leaders, she said, quote, Stop talking. Start doing. We need action. This, Mr. Speaker, is our opportunity to act. Now, outside of this building, this legislation has tremendous support. The leading children's research hospitals, United for Medical Research, and over 100 patient advocacy groups support this bill. Currently, it leads all other bills on cosponsor.gov with over 2,500 citizen co-sponsors. Now, this kind of support is great, but what matters now are the members of this House and how they vote. The question before members today is simple. What is more important, finding cures for our children or balloons for party conventions and catering for politicians? The bottom line is this bill is a choice between allocating monies for political conventions or pediatric medical research. That's the choice. The bill isn't just about a government agency or taxpayer dollars. It's not about Democratic issues or Republican issues. It's about a cause, frankly, that should unite each and every one of us. And yes, I would say to my colleague from California, this is a serious first step. It is not everything. And to sit here and impugn anyone's motives, much less say something that somehow is a commentary that this isn't constructive towards the plight of the parents like the Millers who are around this country searching for some indication that we can break the political gridlock on an issue like this. And I align myself with the comments of my colleague from Vermont who says, can't we just put down the battle axes for something like this? Can't we all do that for somebody like Gabriella? Now, Gabriella may no longer be with us, but her fight lives on. I ask, Mr. Speaker, that all of us stand united today and join in this fight. And again, I want to thank Congressman Greg Harper. I want to thank Congressman Peter Welch for introducing this bill, as well as Congressman Koehl from Oklahoma. And earlier this year, they began the effort to join with so many that have come before to raise awareness for the need for medical research. And yes, this time the need for us to prioritize funding for pediatric research. I'd like to thank Gabriella's parents, the Millers, who are so brave in their commitment to this effort and realize this is just the first step, for being here with us today and for joining us in this fight. And I strongly urge my colleagues to support this bill. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. All members should be reminded that it is not in order to introduce or to bring to the attention of the House occupants of the gallery. The Chair will remind all persons in the gallery that they are here as guests of the House and that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings is in violation of the rules of the House. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Koehl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, sir. I oppose this legislation because it's window dressing, and it's not the big picture. $13 million is less than 1% of the $1.5 billion sequester cut. Less than 1%. The NIH is our research institution. It's our Department of Defense. It defends us from cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's and AIDS and diabetes. But it's not being prioritized, and it should be the #1 priority of this House, keeping Americans safe and alive. Now, the $13 million was picked because that's the amount of money we put into political conventions. It just so happened to fit. We could have picked the F-35 bomber and saved billions of dollars and taken that out, which we don't need, and put that money, which would have made a real difference in research. And Kids First Research, I live in the city that's the best pediatric cancer facility in the world, St. Jude Children's Hospital. They need more than this. And kids later will get Alzheimer's and AIDS and heart disease and cancer, and they need to be protected. In the long run, they can only be protected by full funding for NIH, and I urge full funding for NIH and not smoke and mirrors. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield 3 minutes to the co-sponsor, or to the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Harper from Mississippi. 3 minutes. Member of the Energy and Commerce Committee
is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank, first of all, Congressman Peter Welch for his hard work on this bill, and certainly for Leader Eric Cantor and Congressman Tom Koehl. Creating a lifetime of hope and opportunity for our most vulnerable kids is more important than subsidizing week-long political pep rallies for the Democratic and Republican parties. This is why the House must advance H.R. 2019, the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act, a bill that pays for children's medical research with $126 million that the federal government currently sets aside for political conventions. On November 14, 2013, I had the privilege to meet in Leader Cantor's office with Ellen and Mark Miller. I watched them struggle to come up with the words to express their grief, which I saw become steadfast determination to do something special for Gabriella by allowing this bill to be named after their precious daughter. I'm wearing the yellow Smashing Walnuts bracelet that they gave me that day. I've watched numerous videos of Gabriella where she has made moving and profound statements such as, once you get cancer, you kind of got to be all grown up. And sometimes you have to stop talking and start doing. As the father of a 24-year-old son living with Fragile X syndrome, I understand the challenges families face raising children with special needs. But I also recognize the value of expanded and improved medical research. While raising a child with a genetic disorder can be very difficult, for my family it's been a blessing, especially knowing that my son Livingston is here today. Mr. Speaker, kids from Mississippi, like Evie Horton and her cousin Reese McDonald, who fight with all of their strength to overcome the struggles of spinal muscular atrophy, are two more reasons that I introduced this bill. And recent scientific research breakthroughs have given hope to so many families, but in order for clinical trials and other advancements to meet their full potential, additional federal research must be directed. Mr. Speaker, members of both parties have an opportunity to demonstrate the priorities of this body. Will it be research for our most vulnerable kids? Or will lawmakers vote to continue funding political party conventions at the taxpayers' expenses? You know, Mr. Speaker, I've listened to how this has been described by the other side. It's been called a joke, a ruse, a fraud, not credible, window dressing, smoke and mirrors. And to have been told, too, that they, Mr. Speaker, being referred that the Republicans supported sequestration, I guess means that it's been forgotten that our friends on the other side of the aisle, that 95 members of the Democratic Party voted in favor of sequestration. Mr. Speaker, let's get our priorities straight. Let's vote yes on the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed H.R. 2922 to extend the authority of the Supreme Court police to protect court officials away from the Supreme Court grounds.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield now 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price.
The gentleman from North Carolina has yielded 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this is a sad and indeed depressing debate because there's such a transparent effort underway to weaken our nation's campaign finance laws even further by the perfectly legitimate, compelling case for sick children in our country. This represents the worst of Republican cynicism, and I've just got to say it. And since this measure stands no chance of passing the Senate, it's a fitting end to the least productive session of Congress in modern history. Passage of this bill will do nothing to increase federal funding of pediatric disease research. That's why it's so cynical. Simply authorizing a new program will not translate into additional funding in the current appropriations environment. If the majority were really serious, they wouldn't have passed a budget that makes adequate funding for medical research impossible. Or perhaps they would actually try to negotiate a comprehensive budget agreement that lifts sequestration once and for all, lifts it from pediatric research and many other priorities. Now, to make matters worse, this bill would make it more difficult to modernize and reinvigorate one of the most successful examples of campaign finance reform in our nation's history, the Presidential Public Financing Program, which has given candidates a viable alternative to private and corporate fundraising for more than 3 decades. Now, I agree with my colleagues from both parties that paying for presidential nominating conventions is not a wise use of taxpayer dollars. But if the House majority is truly concerned about this issue, I'd encourage them to schedule a vote on my bill, the Empowering Citizens Act, which would not only prevent taxpayer dollars from being used for conventions, but also includes important soft money provisions to prevent high-dollar special interests from funding conventions. The Empowering Citizens Act would mend, not end, the presidential public financing system, bringing it up to date with campaign realities. It would also establish a voluntary small donor public funding program for congressional campaigns, as well as strong rules forbidding coordination between super PACs and political parties or campaigns. I believe we're at a tipping point in the short history of campaign finance reform in our country. We can either choose to stand by the common sense reforms that restored America's faith in elections after the Watergate scandal, or we can choose to cede control of political campaigns entirely to wealthy corporations and interest groups. The responsible choice is clear. So I strongly urge colleagues to oppose this measure in the hope that the Republican majority will both get serious about medical research funding and get serious about the oversized influence of millionaires and billionaires and super PACs in our democracy.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield at this point 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, a co-sponsor and a member of the bill and a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Lance. 1 minute.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act. My colleagues have told the story of Gabriella Miller. She was one of the many young people every year who leave this world too early due to disease. Too many families share this grief. Today we take a step in making a difference in the lives of those struggling with pediatric diseases and disorders such as cancer and autism. Today Congress, working together, will target taxpayer funding for scientific research and life-saving treatments that can lead to better outcomes and, I hope someday, a cure. Especially during the holiday season, we should be thankful for our many blessings. I am thankful in part for the families and advocates whose challenges we may never understand, but whose commitment and love for their children is unyielding and inspiring. Today we take action in their name. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask how much time remains on both sides?
Both sides have 8 minutes remaining.
Thank you. I now yield a minute and a half to the gentlewoman from New York, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. Lowy.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to honor the memory of Gabriella Miller and her courage and the courage of her parents, but I oppose this hypocritical bill. I have spent my career fighting to ensure that our researchers have every resource to find life-saving treatments and cure. This bill would do nothing to increase investments in medical research. It is unfathomable to me that those who champion the cuts of $1.55 billion to the NIH now try to authorize with no promise to fund. That cut of $1.55 billion led to a cut of $255 billion to the National Cancer Institute and $66 million to the Child Health Institute that funds pediatric research. My heart is with the family of Gabriella Miller and my dear friends who lost a little girl of about 6 years old from a childhood cancer, and I'll never forget it. Let's work together to truly fund, to appropriate money, not pretend by authorizing. It's a nice thing to do, but we have to vote no on this cynical bill. And I ask today that we join together to increase investments, to increase funding for pediatric research, not support cuts to the National Cancer Institute, cuts to the National Institutes of Health. And I yield back the balance.
Lady's time's expired. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this point I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Oklahoma, member of the Appropriations Committee and a co-sponsor of the bill, Mr. Koehl. 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend for yielding. I want to begin by praising my friend Greg Harper and my friend Peter Welch, who've come to this floor with a very worthy purpose, and that's to redirect government funding toward something that's not particularly important, toward something that's very important, medical research for children. The question when you have a worthy goal is always, how do you pay for it? Where will you actually get the resources? For many years, I brought to this floor legislation that would eliminate public funding for political party conventions and presidential campaigns. I could go into debate ad infinitum. The president's never used any public funding, didn't feel the need for it in either of his two campaigns, neither did Mr. Romney. Now, on the political conventions, both political parties this year actually did take the money. I can tell you, as a former chief of staff of the Republican National Committee who put on a convention in 2000, they don't need it. They absolutely do not need it. They can raise all the money they need from private sources, just as their nominees raise money from private sources. That bill has actually passed this House on multiple occasions with a bipartisan vote. I was prepared to do that again, and I got a call from Leader Cantor. He said, Tom, I know you've been working on this problem for a long time. I know you're concerned about it. What if we redirected that money towards something that is a better purpose, a better use of public dollars? And he mentioned Greg's bill, and I couldn't agree with him more. So for those of you that are looking for something sinister or trying to link this to something it's not connected to, like the sequester, it's simply a modest step in the right direction, and it takes money that we know is wasted and puts it to good use. For those of you that say it can't pass the other body in the last Congress on an amendment voted 95-5 to take away public funding of political conventions. We still have a disagreement on presidential campaigns, but funding political conventions really is more important than directing this money to a more worthy purpose. We're not even trying to take it out of the federal budget. I just think that kind of logic defies imagination. This is a good faith effort to do something that ought to bring us together instead of pull us apart. It's a modest step. I'd be the first to admit that. But let's take the modest step in the right direction, take public dollars that we're now wasting on political conventions, give them to researchers, and let them do their work. That's just simply a better use of the public purse in a time of limited means. So I urge support for my friend's bill, H.R. 2019, Mr. Harper and Mr. Welch. I want to thank Leader Cantor. This was his idea of bringing two good ideas together. I think it's a good one. I hope this House embraces it in a bipartisan fashion. I want to thank my friend, the Chairman of Energy and Commerce, for his effort to bring this forward and advance it. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, who is the ranking member of the Labor HHS Appropriations Subcommittee, Ms. DeLauro.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
I rise in opposition to the so-called Kids First Research Act, which, despite its name, does absolutely nothing to support either kids or pediatric research. This bill does not include a single additional dollar for pediatric research. It just ends another program. It merely suggests this money should be used to fund NIH if and only if a later appropriations bill calls for it. The money does not automatically go for pediatric research. This is a feel-good messaging bill that plays a bait-and-switch on American families, hoping and praying for research dollars to save their children. This majority wants to pretend that they are supporting medical research when in fact they have continually cut this fundamental priority since 2011. Consider the very first bill passed in this House in 2011, H.R. 1. That bill, supported by all but 3 Republicans, almost every single member of this majority voted to cut $1.6 billion from the National Institutes of Health. And most of those who have spoken this morning were those who voted to make that cut. That's a cut is 100 times larger than the $12.6 million increase that this legislation pretends to provide. And because of the deep and reckless sequestration cuts, NIH has been cut by $1.5 billion more. And we don't know whether the budget deal that's being discussed today will put that money back. Because of these misguided policies, the National Cancer Institute has been slashed by $255 million and the Child Health Institute by $66 million. Mr. Speaker, may I have an additional minute?
Yield additional minute to the gentlewoman.
Thank you.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
I strongly support investing in medical research. My heart goes out to the Miller family. I am a cancer survivor. One of my proudest accomplishments in this body is working in a bipartisan fashion to double the NIH budget between 1998 and 2003. We did it then, and it's something that we need to do it again. But this bill is a sham. And if the majority believes, as I do, that we should increase funding for pediatric research, then let us increase funding for pediatric research. Let us not waste time playing games and misleading the American people. And I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to a co-sponsor of the bill, Mr. Collins.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm honored today to add my name to the list of those who support this legislation. H.R. 2019 bears the name of a child whose bravery and wisdom should inspire us all. Gabriella Miller reminds us that government has the ability and the obligation to strive for the greater good, to protect the innocent, to preserve their future. And if we lose sight of that goal, we have failed. In the year that I've been in Congress, most of my time has been fighting against bad policies and bad politics. But today is different. Today I stand before this body to proclaim we can do something and we can help. The Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act priorities pediatric research to help children with autism, cancer, and other diseases. If you were to ask me what defines Doug Collins, I would tell you 3 things. I'm a man of faith, I'm a husband, and a father. A father to a daughter who has spina bifida, but also inspires me to be the type of person that I would want to be. She, like Gabriella Miller, who have overcome, and Gabriella Miller really won her fight. My daughter continues. Have reminded us that you can help, and when you can help, you should. When you can make a difference, no matter how small, it still matters. It's still worth doing. I'm a freshman here, and I did not, as has been previously said, but what has amazed me is when you take a step forward in putting something productive on the floor, in which it makes at least a small statement, and Congressman Harper brings forth that with others. When you put a small step forward, you are brought down to this floor and ridiculed and said it's window dressing. I am sorry. This is not window dressing. It is a step toward being the government we're called to be, and that is prioritizing. That is putting faith back into a system in which people have lost faith. And on the floor today, it is no wonder that they've lost faith. When a good faith effort is put forward and it is criticized in light of children and research to make other political points, that is what's truly appalling today. That is what is bad. This is a simple step that was brought forth in good faith. All I'm saying is, let's prioritize. I agree with my friends across the aisle. It's time we prioritize our mission. It's time we prioritize our battles here. This is one step forward, and I would encourage all members to support something that actually does make a difference. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, our Democratic whip.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentleman who preceded me said he's a freshman. I've been here for 33 years. For 23 of those years, I served on the Labor, Health, Human Services Appropriations Subcommittee. I served under some extraordinary Republicans and some extraordinary Democrats who chaired that committee. The ones I served under made sure that the NIH got the resources it needed to investigate, research, and try to come up with the cures that will ameliorate the afflictions of mankind from a health perspective. Of the sponsors of this bill, 134 of them voted for the Ryan budget. The Ryan budget, had it been adopted, had it been implemented, would have cut the National Institute of Health by $6 billion. The budget that we're going to consider will still require reductions in NIH funding by perhaps as much as 80 times to 100 times the money that is theoretically in this bill. And by the way, there is no money in this bill. This is an authorization. As I'm sure Ms. DeLauro, who is the ranking member, has pointed out, it provides no money. And many of you perhaps are going to vote for a budget that will cut NIH. But you're going to pass a bill, and that's what Mr. Collins apparently is concerned about, because we're saying that this is a facade, a pretense of support. Paper will not help pediatric research. Money will. Investment will. I ask for an additional, what do you got?
I yield an additional minute to the gentleman.
The gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
To that extent, this is not real. It is a message. Everybody on this floor, I presume, is for children's health, is for pediatric research, is for trying to make sure that our children are healthy and saved from disease and affliction. I presume all of us are for it. But talk is cheap. The Ryan budget would have cut $800 million from pediatric research alone. 134 of the sponsors, 134 of the sponsors of this bill voted for the Ryan budget. So in other words, on one hand, you're given, theoretically, if there was money available to do this, $11 million for pediatric research with this hand. That's 113 over 10. And $800 million being taken away with this hand. Who do you think you're fooling? 1 more minute.
I would yield whatever time I have remaining.
The gentleman has 30 seconds remaining.
So let us not fool the public that we're doing something for pediatric research. And I know my friend Mr. Upton has been a supporter of NIH in years past, and he is my dear friend, a good friend, and a good member. But I tell my friend, This bill does not do anything for pediatric research. You'll have an opportunity to vote for pediatric research. Vote to get rid of the sequester. Vote to invest in the National Institute of Health, not to cut it. That'll make a difference for pediatric research. I urge the defeat of this bill.
Gentleman from New Jersey's time's expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I just ask so that gentleman, Mr. Pallone, has no time left, is that right?
His time's expired.
And I have 3
You
minutes?
have 3 minutes.
I yield myself the balance of our time.
Your gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I did appreciate the nice words that were directed to me by my friend, Mr. Hoyer, in support of the NIH. And I will remind those that don't know that I was the Republican lead a number of years ago with Mr. Waxman and Mr. McCain and Mr. Wellstone to double the money for the NIH, one of the most significant things that this Congress, I think, has ever done. But I got to say that I simply don't understand the opposition to this bill. Yes, I am absolutely supportive of the NIH bill, and we'll continue to do that and more money. The Ryan Murray budget agreement, which we'll be voting on tomorrow, I'll be supporting. And it includes programs like the NIH, which I'm told will be increased about $23 billion, or 2% over the current levels. In today's The Hill, there's an ad, a full-page ad here, offered by First Focus Campaign for Children. It says, "Thank you for making children your first focus." And that lists maybe as many as 80 to 100 members, including many of those that spoke today against the bill. But it says, "Thank you for making children your first focus." That's what this bill is about. And it's not just a simple authorization. Yes, we do pass those from time to time. This actually directs the language of the bill. Says, and I quote, "shall be transferred." Shall. Doesn't use the word may, maybe, whatever. Shall be transferred to a fund in the Treasury to be known as the 10-year Pediatric Research Initiative Fund, which shall, not may, which shall be available only for the purpose provided in the Public Health Service Act, and only to the extent in which such sums as are provided in Advance and Appropriations Acts. We made it pretty tight. The authors of this bill made it pretty tight. Tell me how we can make it tighter. We all cried.
The gentleman yelled, I'd be glad to tell him.
I'm sorry.
I'd be glad to make a suggestion on how you could do that.
Well, to me, I mean, we use shall a number of different times.
You've got to have money.
Well, that's what we do. We take money.
If you don't have any money, you can't spend it.
The money comes from the political conventions. I mean, that's the direct offsets that's used. All of us cry for these families that lose these beautiful little kids. This bill, if it passes and gets enacted, will provide money to help families like Gabrielle's, who lost a beautiful little girl who really used the last year of her life to promote a fund like this, and work with the NIH. That's what this should be all about. And I commend Mr. Cantor and others. The rules that we have here is you've got to find an offset when you increase spending. That's what this bill does. And it finds an offset that I think many of us could accept to actually fund the program and direct the dollars to a fund within the NIH to make sure that it works. That's what we want to happen. And I would urge my colleagues to vote for this bill. Yes, it's under suspension, no amendments, we need a 2/3 vote. So I would ask my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2019 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3.
Speaker, I would ask for recorded vote.
The opinion of the Chair. The gentleman asked for the yeas and nays.
Yes.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on suspending the rules and passing H.R. 2019 will be followed by 5-minute votes on suspending the rules and passing H.R. 2319, Senate Bill 1471, H.R. 3212, and H.R. 1992.
This is a 15-minute vote.
A handful of votes in the House, this one on allowing the National Native American Memorial to be built outside on the grounds of the American Indian Museum on the National Mall, instead of the current requirement that it be built inside the museum. The bipartisan budget agreement announced last night is expected to come to the House floor for a vote tomorrow. A CQ roll call writes that House Republicans emerged from a private meeting this morning voicing some reservations about the proposed deal, but were generally supportive of it, leaving GOP leaders optimistic that most of their members will support the deal in a vote Thursday. Speaker John Boehner of Ohio made a simple pitch, telling the Republican conference that while the agreement is modest, it will move the conference past the brinkmanship over the past few years and avoid the threat of a government shutdown or unpalatable stopgap spending bills. That in CQ roll call. Here are Republicans now speaking to reporters after the meeting.